I'm waiting on some food, so I'm happy I found this post. So I'm gonna go on a little rant about it. You guys know I like to do this with my woo-woo stuff and my scientific stuff and blah, blah, blah. I'm so glad I found this post because, you know, part of shifting culture back to what it was is literally just going back to our roots, right? You're just, in 3D, you're just traveling on a timeline one way and then trying to reverse it the other way and then finding a middle ground, right? Which is the middle frequency we're all trying to find. And when it comes to New Age spirituality, you know, they call it New Age, and it is something that has typically been very whitewashed because you see it a lot like the LGBT movement with the transgender community. And I'm not talking about the actual struggles. I'm talking about the fad that has arisen from the struggle and, you know, that kind of shadow side of it that is inauthentic versus the authentic side. So you see this with the LGBT plus alphabet soup community, and then you also see it with New Age spirituality. It's called New Age, but there's nothing new about it. Most basis from New Age spirituality is actually typically, again, like she's saying, any tribal spirituality that came from brown and black peoples, and you know, things like paganism or Wicca and stuff like that, which has been around for centuries. So what New Age is actually the reawakening of things that we have tried to deaden the impulse of or hide the education of for centuries, and things that have been whitewashed. So now let's talk about Western and Eastern ideology, and let's talk about duality and hermetics for a second, okay? So in the grand scheme of things, this whole race war and its ties to religion actually have a lot more to do with the knowledge within, knowledge without, like duality principle, right? And how at the end of the day, race is not a thing, but most cultures, the race war that they have is not necessarily one race versus the other, because every race has had slavery and race issues within themselves and then with other nations. So what it boils down to is light versus dark. And that polarity is usually created because the light and the dark are counterparts of each other, and that's why they war within those factions, right? So when you bring this to spirituality, you have light or white spirituality, and then you have dark or indigenous and brown and black people's spirituality, and those two factions have warred against each other since the beginning of time. And when it comes to the terms, when we say woo-woo, or when we're talking about, you know, calling things like it's misunderstood or that's mystical magic crap, or, you know, whatever words we apply to it, we apply to mysticism things that we can't typically describe with logic, with what I'm going to get into as the knowledge without. So the only difference between logic and internal wisdom, which is what intuition is the polarity of knowledge within or knowledge without. So it's an opposite flow of the information. So I am going to put this in a very logical context so it fits the 3D concept, so this can resonate with people a little bit more. What a lot of indigenous tribal people did, which are the brown and black peoples of the nation, either light brown like me or really dark brown like Seal, right? Civilizations started with knowledge within flowing outward, and then what the polarity of that does, or the whitewashing, is coming from the opposite perspective of finding knowledge without and then pulling it inward. So all it is just a crossing of those timelines and a battling of those timelines, and then you're going to see that become interwoven. So we're going to move in society from one polar opposite to the other to experience both sides fully, because this is what Source tries to do to gain optimal knowledge. And then once both of those meters are full, so to speak, they put them together to essentially create a really fire mashup track, right? So you have one oppressed nation, then the other oppressed nation, and they kind of switch roles. And then at the end, they kind of join forces. So you have both perspectives coming from both directions and flowing both ways and then intertwining. And that is kind of the 3D alchemy of what happens with most things. So when it comes to religion, why tribal peoples and darker peoples have always been persecuted is because they are coming from the opposite perspective of knowledge coming within first and then flowing outward. And then the Western ideology, or the whitewashed ideology, that often took that is just a mirror counterpart as a hermetic principle of knowledge that is not found within. So it is first found without and then flows inward. It's the exact same thing. They're both talking about the same thing. They're just coming from the opposite spectrum on the timeline before they intertwine. So to put in context what has happened in the past, this is the persecution, or the perceived persecution, that we see with that battle happening between those two groups, especially in America, because we know a lot about Black and Indigenous slavery here and why those religions and spiritualities were stamped out. And when the people were colonized, like the fact that Native American people like me were often forced to cut their hair, which was actually kind of a sin in our culture, right? But we'll get into all that in another video. But this is the re-emerging of those things, of knowledge within flowing outward after having a culture dominated with finding the information outward to flow inside. And then when you think about the hierarchy of what always stands in the end, this is why J. Cole in GOMD always says that the N is better, or the black man is better, because whoever comes from the bottom, or whoever deals with the most oppression, accumulates the most experience, accumulates the most knowledge, and alchemizes the most dark energy. So they experience more of both sides of the polarities, and they get to intertwine it and bring it into union more. So that energy is actually more expansive. So the group that is oppressed first, or oppressed the longest, is actually going to accumulate the most energy, alchemize the most energy, and then end up on top when you flow to the end of the timeline. So what is happening with tribal groups, which is literally anybody who's brown, and then even quote unquote white people are also brown. You guys saw me post something about that. So it's supposed to come into union. But what's happening first is that rising up from the bottom, or re-emergence. So whatever was oppressed or repressed, which is what happens in the spiritual journey, okay, comes back up to the surface to be relived, because you cannot oppress holy energy. It does not work on a long enough timeline. It will eventually rise to the surface again. That's the infinite energy. And then when it comes to manifesting, let's talk about why the re-emerging is happening, and why whitewashing happened first and is now finally being stamped out, and why spirituality and spiritual awakenings are on a huge rise in society. So when it comes to manifesting, and when it comes to the spiritual journey, you learn to go within. You learn to reverse finding things and picking the fruit from the outside and using that to fill you. And you learn how to fill from the outside to inside, to spill out to the outside world. So this is what happened with knowledge, and this is currently what's happening with knowledge. We're learning how to find the knowledge within instead of finding it in the 3D universe and then pushing out that hierarchy back into the 3D universe. So it's really not that woo-woo when you think about it.